Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and really thrilled to be on this panel. As I thought about the challenge of pluralism, religious pluralism today, I kept narrowing it down a little bit to what I work on a great deal. And at one point towards the end of your talk, you mentioned the points of progress. And one of these you mentioned is the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, which was signed by Pope Francis and Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. Freedom is a right of every person. Each individual enjoys the freedom of belief, thought, expression, and action. The pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in His wisdom through which He created human beings. This divine wisdom is the source from which the right to freedom of belief and the freedom to be different derives. Therefore, the fact that people are forced to adhere to a certain religion or culture must be rejected, as to the imposition of a cultural way of life that others do not accept. This is the second of 12 convictions listed in this document. The statement 13 months ago caused quite a stir in itself, just this one part of it. The first papal trip to the Arabian Peninsula and the signing and issuance of this statement, far beyond anything on religious tolerance, human fraternity, men and women of all religions, and presumably those without religions, to accompany one another for world peace and life together. As became evident with some investigation, the statement had its origins in the April 2017, 2 years earlier, apostolic journey of Pope Francis to Egypt, where he had a private conversation with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, and he delivered an address at an Al-Azhar conference. Pope Francis did not make public the substance of his private conversation with the Grand Imam, but his address is available, of course. Miguel Ayuso, now Cardinal Ayuso Giso, as you said, and president of Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, directed me to that April address and this particular paragraph. Precisely in the field of dialogue, particularly interreligious dialogue, we are constantly called to walk together in the conviction that the future also depends on the encounter of religions and cultures. In this regard, the work of the Mixed Committee for Dialogue between the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue and the Committee of Al-Azhar for Dialogue offers us a concrete, encouraging example. 3 basic areas of, if properly linked to one another, can assist in this dialogue: the duty to respect one's own identity and that of others, the courage to accept differences, and the sincerity of intentions. Those were the 3 points Bishop, now Cardinal Ayuso, wanted me to read, and I assumed he had a little bit to do with writing the text. Michel could tell us all about that, I presume, when he worked in the Holy See. When I first read the words, though, the pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in His wisdom, I thought of the Quran. For example, I know that Asma is going to do this too, so I'll be very light. Surah 5, Al-Ma'idah 48, if God willed, He could have made you one community, but He wanted to test you through that which He has given you. So race or compete to be good, to do good. You will all return to God, and He will make clear to you the matters you differed about. So God will reveal this. Also, the second Surah, Al-Baqarah 148, each community has its own direction to which it turns. Race, compete to do good deeds, and wherever you are, God will bring you together. God has power to do everything. And then, of course, the famous 256, verse 256, there is no compulsion in religion. True guidance has become distinct from error. So whoever rejects false gods and believes in God has grasped the firmest handhold, one that will never break. God is all-hearing and all-knowing. The document on human fraternity has the line, therefore, the fact that people are forced to adhere to a certain religion or culture must be rejected. The Quran is very clear, to me anyway, reading it, on religious pluralism and divine wisdom. The Bible is more subtle in endorsing religious pluralism. St. Paul in Athens said, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. I found among the many objects of your worship, he was a Jew, remember that, and he was holding himself in check. I find among the objects of your worship an altar with an inscription to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you. Or Solomon at prayer in the new temple he had built. And thanks to Tamara for leading me to this verse. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Perhaps it is in this directness of the Quran that caused reaction among Christians to Pope Francis entering to an agreement with the Grand Imam that the pluralism and diversities of religion are willed by God. Cardinal Raymond Burke, one of the Pope's public critics, is quoted to say that the plurality or diversity of religions is good. That's a mistaken notion, and it certainly is confusing for the faithful regarding salvation. It's so good that he's concerned about our confusion. Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, was probably the most reputable critic on this passage. He served 5 years. He served a 5-year term, and he issued a manifesto of faith 4 days after the Abu Dhabi text. Citing the Catechism of the Catholic Church, he said, the distinction of the three persons in the divine unity makes a fundamental difference in the belief in God and the image of man from that of other religions. Religions disagree precisely over the belief in Jesus the Christ. Now, Cardinal Walter Kasper, another German, who's emeritus president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, responded 4 days later by pointing out a truth. One, you have pointed out the truth of the Trinity, Cardinal Mueller, one that even Protestants agree to. He had to say that in ecumenism. And then, but you have firmly obscured the other half of the truth, namely similarities, especially with Jews and Muslims in the belief in the one God. And are there not similarities today fundamental to peace in the world and in society? Half the truth is not Catholic truth. What a soundbite. He said, the blanket statements need nuancing and attention to pastoral needs, and yet other statements in it amounting to a manifesto of theological opinion and not a manifesto of faith. So his Council of Christian Unity for the Cardinal Kasper is heir to the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, which produced the Decree on Ecumenism, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, and the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions at Vatican II. The latter used the term religions in 1963 in a positive sense for the first time in the history of Catholic Church councils. One expects from the various religions answers to the enigmas of the human condition, which even today, even as of old, deeply stir human hearts. The final paragraph of the Declaration contains this little gem. The Church reproves as foreign to the mind of Christ any discrimination or harassment of men or women because of their race or color, condition in life, or religion. So the first introductory paragraph of the document on human fraternity of 2019 says, faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or a sister to be supported and loved. Through faith in God, who has created the universe, creatures, and all human beings, equal on account of his mercy, believers are called to express this human fraternity by safeguarding creation and the entire universe and supporting all persons. And Nostra Aetate, the document on interreligious dialogue, concludes, we cannot truly call upon God, the Father of all, if we refuse to behave as sisters and brothers with anyone, created as we all are in the image of God. The relation of man to woman to God and the Father and their relations to their fellow human beings are linked to such a degree that the Holy Scripture says, whoever does not love does not know God. So, we went a long time in the history of the church before we used the word religion, but in a way, maybe that's because it was a product of the modern age and fields of anthropology and sociology and so forth, identifying what it is among peoples. Up until Vatican II, the term religion and religions were used only at the First Vatican Council, 1869 and 1870, which was suspended as Rome was likely to fall to the forces of Garibaldi in the efforts to unify Italy. There are then references in this 19th century period to true religion and the Christian religion as synonymous terms, and false religion, but what those espouse who have not embraced the Catholic truth. Generally, others are referred to by name and not by the term religion or the term of their religion. So the first positive use of the word religions was actually used by Paul VI at the opening of the Second Vatican Council, second period, September 29th, 1963, when he asked the Council Fathers, towards the end of his opening address, his first as Pope, this is how I think the Council will go forward, the Church's self-examination and its relations to all of these groups. And then he got to the final part, inviting the Council Fathers to look beyond your own sphere and observe those other religions that uphold the meaning and concept of God as one, creator, provident, and most high, and transcendent, that worship God with acts of sincere piety, and upon whose beliefs and practices the principles of moral and social life are founded. He had already spoken of how God showers his favors on everyone. Then in his encyclical on the church in August of 64, Ecclesiam Suum, on the church and dialogue, where he introduced the word dialogue too into the the council conversation. But we do not wish to turn a blind eye to the spiritual and moral values of the various non-Christian religions, for we desire to join with them in promoting and defending common ideals in the spheres of religious liberty, human brotherhood, education, culture, social welfare, and civic order. Dialogue is possible in all of these great projects, which are our concern as such as theirs. We will not fail to offer opportunities for discussion in the events of such an offer being favorably received in genuine and mutual respect. So, stage was set, and a document on the declaration on the relation of the church to non-Christian religions was brought forward at the Council, Nostra Aetate, which spoke very positively. Vatican II left many questions open for further discussion. For example, relevant to us, the questions of the relationship between dialogue and mission and the salvific status of other religions. In 1991, Pope John Paul II, in an encyclical on mission, now he's the one that invited religious leaders to join with him in 1986, 1993, and 2002 in Assisi to pray for peace as a great symbolic action of coming together. He said in his encyclical on mission, God does not fail to make himself known to all peoples, especially through their religions. At Christmas time, let's go on with this. In the Abu Dhabi text, we read, willed by God in the wisdom. We look to the world in the faith that is shaped by the Bible and the church. God's wisdom has placed us into the story, so we are to contribute to the transformation of all that is. Almost 5 years ago, Pope Francis in Laudato Si, his encyclical on climate change and the crises that the Earth community is facing, wrote that the majority of people living on our planet profess to be believers. This should spur religions to dialogue among themselves for the sake of protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity. This was already relevant in his document, The Joy of the Gospel, which was the tone-setting text of his papacy. And then don't forget the most recent Carrera Amazonia, after the Amazonian Synod. In an Amazonian region characterized by many religions, we believers need to find occasions to speak to one another, to act together for the common good and the promotion of the poor. This has nothing to do with the watering down or concealing of deeper convictions. When we encounter others who think differently than ourselves, if we believe that the Holy Spirit can work amid differences, then we will try to let ourselves be enriched by that insight while embracing it from the core of our own convictions and our own identity. For the deeper, stronger, and richer that identity is, the more we will be capable of enriching others with our own proper contribution. Pope Francis' approach, the challenge today, the contemporary approach is this: let us be practical, and let us be pastoral, and let us be sensitive to the needs of the Earth community and work together. Yes, theological, scholarly dialogue should go on. We'll have that when God comes to judge the living and the dead. But we need to move ahead and trust one another in human fraternity. Ignorance, yes, is one of the challenges that we face regarding religious pluralism. Some of that ignorance is addressed through education, but a lot of the ignorance can be overcome through action and acting together. So I would suggest then that we are slowly but surely embracing what we said 60 years ago at Vatican II and have embraced, and now under Pope Francis in a kind of new encouragement, this walking together, which he has done emblematically now with Imam al-Taib of Al-Azhar, I think is an example of how he wants us to go forward in addressing religious pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll move on to Asma and then to Tom, and I probably will be flashing something at a certain point that say you have to move towards a conclusion because we want to have some time for Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pluralism and diversity, often used interchangeably, are among those modern concepts that many of us, particularly I think in this room, would immediately recognize as something positive and worthy of achieving. Although the concept of liberal pluralism would not be born until roughly the 1950s, the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville would already notice this phenomenon when he visited the United States in the 1830s. He described American society then as consisting of a plurality of groups which allowed for individuals to inhabit multiple identities. It is still, and even more so, true today. One may argue, and some indeed have, that the case for pluralism should be relatively easy to make in Islamic context. And here I want to thank John Borelli for setting the stage for me. There are, in fact, a considerable number of modern Muslims who are positively disposed towards the idea of pluralism, and they draw upon the resources they find in their scripture and religious traditions and in the lived experience of Muslims through history to make their case. They typically tend to argue that toleration of religious and ethnic diversity is in fact a cherished core value within Islam. And one of the proof texts frequently cited in this context is taken from the Quran, which in chapter 49, verse 13 states, "O humankind, we have created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes that you might get to know one another. The noblest of you in God's sight is the one who is most righteous." Another verse, the one that was mentioned by John, verse 48 from chapter 5 of the Quran states, "For every one of you we have appointed a different law and way of life, and if God had so willed, he could surely have made you all one single community. But he willed it otherwise, in order to test you by means of what he has given you. Vie then with one another in doing good works. To God you all must return, and then he will make you truly understand all that on which you were inclined to differ." End of quote. According to the Quranic view of prophecy, various prophets were sent over time to different communities to give them specific laws and to indicate a way of life to their people in keeping with their genius and in a manner that would ensure their spiritual and social well-being. This is further emphasized in that part of the verse I just quoted from chapter 548, which states, "And if God had so willed, he could surely have made you all one single community." It would not be difficult for God, after all, to fashion a single community out of all humankind. But the Quranic view is that diversity is a divinely mandated feature which adds richness and variety to human existence. And in fact, a wide variety of local customs and religious practices have traditionally been tolerated in Muslim-majority societies through time. The scripturally mandated pluralism is understood to be reflected in other verses as well. The Quran, for instance, does not maintain that there is only one way to pray to the Almighty. It recognizes that there is more than one. Thus, the Quran says, "For each community there is a direction in which it turns, that is in prayer, so vie with one another in good works." And this is from chapter 2, verse 148. The Quran also refers to freedom of conscience and the right to choose one's religion. In the second chapter, verse 256, the Quran clearly states that there is no compulsion in religion, a verse that is frequently cited in modern discourses, Muslim discourses today. It also further maintains that all the children of Adam are honorable, chapter 17, verse 70. It admits of interreligious dialogue with practitioners of other faiths, conducted with civility and respect for the sensibilities of the other party. The Quran counsels in chapter 29, verse 46, "And argue not with the people of the book." The term people of the book, as we know, refers primarily to Jews and Christians. "Except by what is best, save such of them as act unjustly. And say, we believe in that which has been revealed to us and revealed to you, and our God and your God is one, and to him we submit." The theme of the oneness of humankind is repeated in the Quran in different ways. We are told that all human beings have been created of a single soul, chapter 4, verse 1. Again, that they're all descended from the same parents. Still again, that they are, as it were, dwellers in one home, having the same earth as a resting place and the same heaven as a canopy. At the same time, as I've indicated, the Quran also recognizes and accepts the diversity within God's creation. This is not a contradiction. The Islamic worldview has often been described as based on diversity within unity. Within the universal community of human beings who are equal before the divine being, linguistic, ethnic, and cultural differences are embraced as part of God's mercy. These differences are also projected as signs of God. And of his signs, the Quran says, is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your tongues and colors. Surely there are signs in this for the learned. Chapter 30, verse 22. Diversity is thus to be respected and celebrated as a desired feature of the divine design. The verses I've cited so far do not simply represent a scriptural ideal. The early history of Islam contains examples of the efforts of Muslims to translate the ideal into reality. When Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, emigrated from Mecca to Medina, he found himself in a pluralist situation. There was religious as well as tribal diversity in Medina. He not only accepted this diversity, but legitimized it by drawing up an agreement with different religious and tribal groups and accorded them, through this agreement, a dignified existence and rights of their own. This agreement is generally known in English as the Constitution of Medina. This agreement may be regarded as a milestone which sought to lay the foundation of a new political and religious culture in the Arabian Peninsula. What is noteworthy in this agreement is that altogether, Muslims from the Quraysh and other tribes from Mecca, Muslims of Medina belonging to various tribes, and the Jews of Medina belonging to different tribes, together constituted a single community, in Arabic, Ummah Wahida, and explicitly recognized as such in the Constitution. Modern historians of Islam have pointed to this event as the earliest evidence of the pluralist impulse within Islam. Furthermore, our historical sources point to the active participation of many Christians and Jews in the flourishing intellectual life of the Islamic world from the 8th century on. The Islamic civilization at its zenith, roughly between the 8th and 12th centuries of the Common Era, was a cosmopolitan civilization, certainly by pre-modern standards, whose members were of different ethnic, religious, and cultural backgrounds. In the popular mind, the adjective Islamic or Muslim tends to be identified with Arab. This perception, of course, needs to be qualified. Even in the classical and medieval periods of Islamic civilization, those who were its shapers were not only Arabs, but also Persians, Turks and Turkic peoples, Aramaeans, Berbers, Greeks, and Spaniards, among others. And those who belonged to the Islamic or Islamicate civilization were also not only Muslims, but Christians of various stripes, Jews, Sabians, and others. The question that probably comes to the fore right about now is how then to explain certain rejectionist elements coming out of the Muslim majority world today who reject coexistence with different kinds of people. They prove themselves to be extremely intolerant, not only towards non-Muslims, but also towards a large majority of Muslims who happen to disagree with their extreme position. To add more to people's confusion, they too cite specific verses from the Quran and point to historical precedents in defense of their position, and to the relatively uninformed, they appear quite authoritative. And this is where we need to point to the power of scriptural interpretation. Scripture, and this is true whether we're speaking of the Bible, the Quran, or the Bhagavad Gita, is often what its followers make of it. All of these sacred books contain passages that have both potentially inclusivist and exclusivist meanings, that is, inclusive and tolerant, exclusive and intolerant, with the latter version sometimes inciting to violence. Of course, people's behavior cannot be solely attributed to scriptural interpretation. There are also key historical developments that over time have allowed for exclusivist and intolerant trends to become ascendant in some segments of Muslim-majority countries. In more recent history, the period of European colonization, starting in the 19th century, of a large part of the Muslim-majority world, was a period of great anguish and dislocation for the inhabitants of these regions. A relationship of antagonism would be created that fostered jaundiced stereotypes of the Muslim other in the European mind, and the colonized inhabitants would also learn to resent and distrust their Western occupiers. In the post-colonial phase, many Muslim-majority societies are trying to come to grips with modernity and modernization, particularly secular and secularizing aspects, and grappling with the effects of globalization. Many of these changes coming from outside and over which they seem to have little control have brought about convulsive changes in some of these highly traditional societies. There have been a range of reactions to these convulsive changes, from modernist reformers who call for a rereading of Scripture in order to find a modus vivendi with the demands of modern life, to radical extremist groups who insist on very narrow, decontextualized readings of religious texts and appeal to realpolitik to justify their actions. It is the latter group, unfortunately, that has captured most of the world's attention because of the shock value of the terror they inflict on non-Muslims and Muslims alike, and the stridency of their militant rhetoric. Although this has been said before, it bears repetition. The actions of these militants cannot and should not be regarded as representative of mainstream Islam. While there understandably remains lingering resentment over the memory of European colonization of much of the Islamic world, and disenchantment with specific foreign policy measures of the United States that sometimes have had detrimental effects on the lives of people abroad, for the large majority of Muslims today, this is not tantamount to a blanket denunciation of Western societies, and certainly not of Christianity. And it should be pointed out that this disenchantment is shared with other non-Muslim peoples of the global South who have also been subject to European colonization. Many of those who reside in Muslim-majority countries today wish they could, in fact, institute the kind of political freedoms we tend to take for granted here. Many among them wish that they could demand these freedoms of their often corrupt and inept governments without endangering their lives in the process. And some indeed do so out of the conviction that such freedoms are aligned with their own religious and cultural values and are worth fighting for. There are powerful religious and historical precedents, therefore, for the creation of modern civil societies that protect individual and collective liberties for all within the Muslim-majority world today. But there are also the kind of challenges that I just briefly outlined, and I should add also as Prince Zayed outlined in greater detail. And that became quite apparent in the recent popular uprisings that collectively became known as the Arab Spring. Muslims, of course, ultimately bear responsibility for transforming their own societies today and for realizing the pluralist ideal. To cut the ground out from beneath the extremists who threaten to drown out mainstream perspectives, Muslims globally must continue to promote the basic values of peaceful coexistence that recognize and celebrate difference and diversity. These are values, after all, that they share with other decent and humane societies and that they can claim as their very own. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. And finally, Father Tom Michel. We studied together many years ago at the Middle East Center for Arab Studies in Lebanon, Shemlan, known affectionately by some who had a problem with the British folks. I discovered when I tried to go into Syria as the spy school. Yes, he's already smiling because he knows exactly what
Good afternoon. I was talking the other day with John Borelli, and he was telling me the story of one of the Jesuits in Italy was planning a conference on Laudato Si with the Pope. And Pope Francis said to him, don't make it too theological. I'm going to try to follow that advice today. You know, when we look at world events, the way we see them, I think, is always colored and shaped by the region of the world from which we're observing these events. Now, even though I'm American by birth, I spent most of my adult life in Asia, and it's largely forms the perspective from which I view questions of pluralism, particularly religious pluralism, and the struggle for interreligious and intercultural harmony. I'd like to offer today a few observations on events that affect plural societies in Asia. Just 11 months ago, on Easter Sunday last year, gunmen in Sri Lanka killed a total of 259 people and injured another 500, most of them worshippers at Easter morning Mass. Now, people around the world were shocked to discover that the gunmen belonged to a Muslim group and that the target group were Christians. As Christian-Muslim relations in that country had never been angry or inimical, but varied from always correct to often cordial. As two minority groups, both had problems at times with members of the Buddhist majority, but there was no history in Sri Lanka of Muslim-Christian hatred or tension. Well, as we came to understand better the motivation of the killers, we learned that this attack was carried out in response to the killing of Muslims at two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, during Friday prayers just a month earlier in March of that year. In the Christchurch attacks, 51 Muslim worshippers were killed and another 49 injured. Like Sri Lanka, New Zealand was touted as a country where Muslims, mostly of immigrant background, were well accepted and integrated, and there had been no previous history of tension or conflict. So what we have is a group of innocent Christians killed by Muslims at their place of worship, following upon a group of equally innocent Muslims cut down in midst of their act of worship by hate-filled Christian. How do we explain such pointless violence directed at people who were simply carrying out the deepest acts of their faith? Well, when we look around in Asia to see where are the real violations, the mass violations of human rights, where is this going on in Asia? I think all observers would agree that the plight of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar and the Uyghurs in China really have to be at the top of the list. But it's not only there. The detention of Kashmiri intellectuals and others after the suspension of its United Nations sanctioned autonomy, and the recent indiscriminate murders and burnings of Muslims in New Delhi that the Prince referred to earlier. Now they've temporarily found their place in the news. But as time and events move on, these events will fade from public consciousness, but the victims will remember and have to live with their consequences for years to come. Now, my point here is that I understand why Muslims in Sri Lanka and elsewhere in Asia are angry. They feel that Muslims are being wronged and that the powers of this world let it happen. They see Christian governments like that of the United States making lists of profiled countries, Christian European countries closing their doors to Afghan and Syrian refugees, and at the same time popular movies picturing Muslims as primitive savages. And they feel that the present order of things is stacked against them. I think this is the only way, really, that we can explain how some could turn violently against their harmless Christian neighbors in Sri Lanka. I read so many American politicians talking about persecuted Christians, how we must stand in solidarity with them, struggle with them, and for them. And they're right. I want my fellow Christians to be free to practice their faith. But let's keep all of this in perspective. Christians in China, for example, face various difficulties and restrictions, but this is nothing in comparison with the 1 to 2 million Muslim Uyghurs in concentration camps. Or in Myanmar, I worship every Christmas and Easter in a refugee camp of Christian Karens whose villages have been leveled to the ground by the Myanmar military. And they suffer, and they have no place to go. But this really can't compare in breadth or in depth of suffering with what the Rohingya Muslims are going through in the same country. They have no place to go beyond a barren Bangladeshi refugee camp. So I'd like to make just 3 points. I don't want to keep this long, but I have 3 short points. Firstly, so long as we are willing to stand up only for the rights and the dignity of our fellow believers, we become simply another interest group. In a pluralist world, if any group of people is deprived of their rights and livelihood, we're all victims. My second point is that everything is connected. A politician might give an anti-Muslim talk or hate speech in Louisiana or Iowa or elsewhere, and it's read, and believe me, it is read. People read all such things, and it entrenches anger and entrenches desire for revenge in far-flung parts of Asia, and we live with it. And finally, my third point, my final point is pluralism has to be seen as the goal towards which we are working, rather than fooling ourselves into thinking that it is the reality in which we live. And then we have to remember that it's only those who have a vision of a future and who live today as if that vision were already a reality who make history move forward. Thank you.